Reason why things went so wrong in Africa is because the leadership, after independence, rejected Africa's own culture and institutions and went abroad and copied all sorts of foreign systems and ideas and paraphernalia to impose upon the African people. The solutions to Africa's problems lie in Africa itself. It doesn't lie along the corridors of the World Bank. It doesn't lie in the inner sanctum of the Chinese Presidium. Nor does it lie in the sand dunes of Mars. It lies right there in Africa. The post-colonial story about Africa is not pretty. As you're all aware, Africa is the continent which has been ravaged by one crisis after another. I mean, if you look at the number of democracies in Africa, now in 1990, there were only 4 democracies in Africa. Today, after 21 years of reform, the number of democracies in Africa is only 15. 15 out of the 54 African countries, meaning that the vast majority of the African people still live under tyranny. Now, if you look at the economic success stories, there has been some progress, but progress has been marginal. There are only 10 African countries which can be called economic success stories. And fewer than 10 have a free and independent media. Now, many states in Africa have collapsed, and there are many more that are on the verge of collapsing. It shouldn't be that way, because Africa is a continent which is rich in mineral resources. But the mineral wealth of Africa is not being utilized to lift its people out of poverty. Now, why did things go so wrong in Africa? Reason why things went so wrong in Africa is because the leadership, after independence, rejected Africa's own culture and institutions and went abroad and copied all sorts of foreign systems and ideas and paraphernalia to impose upon the African people. Now, this is what makes Africans very angry, very angry. Now, this is what the leadership said. The former Soviet Union is a one-party socialist state, so too must we in Africa. So we had a proliferation of one-party socialist states in Africa. New York has skyscrapers, so too must we in Africa, in the middle of nowhere. Rome has a basilica, so we built one in Yamoussoukro, Ivory Coast. France once had an emperor. So Bokassa of the Central African Republic spent $25 million to recrown himself emperor. I can go on. The list of these unimaginative apings is just horrendous. The continent is littered with the putrid carcasses of failed imported systems. Now African leaders are building Confucius Institutes in Africa. So far, 25 Confucius Institutes have been built in Africa. And we are being told to learn Mandarin. Enough! The solutions to Africa's problems lie in Africa itself. It doesn't lie along the corridors of the World Bank. It doesn't lie in the inner sanctum of the Chinese Presidium. Nor does it lie in the sand dunes of Mars. It lies right there in Africa. Now, let me give you an example. Total foreign aid to Africa from all sources amounts to $30 billion a year. That's what comes into Africa as foreign aid. But Africa's begging bowl leaks. It leaks horribly. What are the leakages? Corruption alone costs Africa $148 billion a year. Corruption. I mean, you cut that in half and that will give you more than enough money. Aid that comes in. Capital flight out of Africa, 80 billion. Food imports, 20 billion. Back in the 1960s, Africa fed itself, not only fed itself, but also exported food. Not anymore today. Military expenditures, $20 billion a year. What are the military in Africa for? Do the soldiers protect the people? Now, if you add up all these leakages, they come up to $268 billion a year. Compare that to the $30 billion that comes in foreign aid. In the late 1980s, the West saw that something had gone wrong. So the West started adding conditionalities to its aid. Now, guess what African leaders did? They took the aid money and did the Babangida boogie. 1 step forward, 3 steps back, a flip and a sidekick to land on the fat Swiss bank account. Much ado about nothing. After a decade of acrobatics, the reform process in Africa has stalled. Now, about the same time, China was growing very, very rapidly. And I'd like to make a distinction between my remarks here, because when I talk about China, I'm talking about the communist government. I'm not talking about the Chinese people. China was growing very, very rapidly, and it needed resources. And Africa had the resources. So China saw an opportunity. Who wouldn't? I don't blame them for it. They saw an opportunity. So they came to Africa and started to woo African leaders with euphonious verbiage and diplomatic platitudes. They started telling African leaders that, well, China is not a colonial power, conveniently forgetting about Tibet. They told African leaders that, well, we are here to trade on equal terms. And they declared 2006 as the Year of Africa. They held a conference in Beijing. And African leaders took the bait, miffed that the West was imposing conditionalities on aid, and also believing in the fallacious notions that the enemy of my enemy must be my friend. 40 African leaders trekked to Chinese and threw themselves at the hand of China, at the feet of China, signing deals. A blizzard of deals were signed for oil, for bauxite, for timber in Nigeria, Angola, Guinea, Mozambique, Gabon, so many countries. Now, the deals, of course, Africa needed to sell its resources. And trade with, Africa's trade with China has blossomed. It's grown from 10 billion in 2000 to more than 100 billion today. And it has also propelled Africa's economic growth rate to 5.8% in 2008, which is good. Okay? And nobody is questioning that. In addition, the Chinese have been investing in infrastructure, which Africa desperately needs, because Africa's infrastructure has crumbled because of neglect and also wars. The World Bank estimates that Africa needs something like 93 billion annually in investments in infrastructure. So the Chinese investments here are welcome. Nobody is questioning that. But the tactics of the Chinese in Africa are objectionable and unwholesome. Number one, the deals which are being signed on barter terms. In other words, China, in Nigeria, for example, China is going to fix Nigeria's dilapidated railway for 5 billion. And in return of that, China will have access to 4 oil plots. Okay? The barter deals are simply in China's favor. In other words, they're so opaque. China brings in all the technicians, all the workers, and so forth. That is what is wrong with that particular type of barter system. Now, secondly, the deals are being signed in secrecy and through bribery, and also by kickbacks. In Namibia, for example, the Chinese company Newtech has been indicted for giving kickbacks to a Namibian company. And China has also been securing the deals by building presidential palaces in Sudan, in Zimbabwe, and also by building sports stadiums in Guinea and also in Congo. Now, the third thing about these deals is that there is no local input in determining whether the deals are good for Africa or not good for Africa. And fourthly, the deals are going to impede economic development and also economic reform in Africa and democratic reform in Africa. Now, the West imposed conditions on its aid. China comes in and says, we're not going to impose any conditions on aid to African countries. Now, what that does is that it gives the African leaders very little incentive to reform their abominable economic and political systems. Now, fifthly, Chinese workers have also been going into the informal and the traditional sectors which have been reserved for Africans. They're not supposed to. But last August, Ghana government arrested foreign miners, foreign nationals in the mining sector, and many of them were Chinese workers in the artisanal mining. If you go to our Arusha market or the market in Kampala, the Chinese traders are also to the resentment of the traders who work in that particular market. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that China should not trade with Africa. China is welcome to do business in Africa, but the business has to be transparent and also has to be above board. There is now growing objections to Chinese forays into Africa. Former South African President Thabo Mbeki describes China's forays into Africa as a new form of colonialism. And as a matter of fact, some African commentaries are also dismissing that as chopsticks mercantilism. Now, China is welcome to do business in Africa with the people in Africa. Otherwise, it will meet its own peril. In Libya, for example, China invested something like $18 billion in infrastructure investments in Libya. When Gaddafi, when the revolution started, China didn't want to give the United Nations the authorization to impose a no-fly zone. And guess what happened? After Muammar Gaddafi was killed, China had to pull out of Libya 22,000 workers. This should not be the case in other African countries, and I believe that if we put enough pressure on China, China will be able to clean up its act. Otherwise, Africa should not look towards China. The solutions that Africa needs can be found in Africa itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Stay where you are.
Please join my Telegram platform by going to my description box and click on the Telegram link. It will take you to the platform. Join us for us to discuss about the well-being of Africa and Africans in diaspora. If today is your first time coming to this channel, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification button so that anytime I upload any great content, you will be notified. I'm always your guy, De-Graft Amoako. Thanks for watching.